Alright, so this is going to be a very math-heavy video. If you don't like math, you can skip to the timestamps I've detailed in the description below. Also, I talk very fast. I might have subtitles out by the time this video comes out. I don't know, but you're gonna have to deal with it for now. Sorry about that. Genshin Impact, popular game. If you don't know what Genshin Impact, ARPG, Breath of the Waifu. That's all you need to know. Now, I understand that this video is going to be pretty redundant for most people, because most people don't have either of these two characters. However, with the two new banners coming out with 1.1, by the time this video comes out actually, this might become a bit more prominent thing because the 4 stars are on there. Also, I like math, I like making videos, I like talking, so there you go. Anyways, those in the community will know that a while back people debated the simple question: who is better, Beidou or Razor? Or what they typically meant, who does more damage? Because everyone likes DPS. Now, for those unfamiliar with the game, the only reason this question could be asked in the first place was because they're both DPS-oriented Electro-Claymore users, which just means that they both deal sustained electric damage with a really big sword. And I want to say this now before people start saying, "Duh, Razor's better, everyone knows this. That's boy Razor." I get that. Most people already acknowledge that Razor does more damage. But how much more damage? How much better is Razor? Does anybody know? Hello? Hello? What kind of numbers are we looking at? That's what I'm going to be solving today. But to do that, we're going to need to conduct a very simple DPS check. However, to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to have to run you through really quick the assumptions and notes that I had to do before making the math. Assumption 1, all DPS is consistent throughout every second of combat. This isn't realistic, but given I can't account for how many enemies there are and how often you're going to dodge, I'm just going to simplify this process and say every single time you attack, that damage is just stretched out throughout that entire duration of attack. Assumption 2, elemental skills and burst are used exactly as their cooldown expires. It means exactly what it says. You're spamming the E and Q button constantly. Assumption 3, burst is always available. This one is kind of doable, I'm not entirely sure, I don't have 2 electro units really. So, if you have 2 electro units, you can put them both in the same team and you get the electro resonance, which means every time you proc an electro-related reaction, you get energy particles. So, realistically, with both of these units, if you have Fischl and you have Sangling, you drop down your E for both those units, and you should pretty much have your burst very constantly up. Is it going to be always available? Probably not, but once I have to start calculating in energy particle regeneration, the math gets kind of weird, especially considering Razor's E's passive abilities and also energy recharge stats on your artifacts. Assumption 4, DPS will not include total damage dealt to every enemy hit. This is actually a pretty common tactic. Most people do not include damage to every enemy hit because the amount of enemies around you is going to be variable. If you're in Spiral of this, you're going to be surrounded by anywhere from 1 enemy to 10. I'm not going to be able to tell how many you're around, so I'm going to be calculating single target damage. Then if you want to, take that damage, apply it to all enemies in that AoE. Great. Assumption 5, both units are at level 70, Ascension 4, Constellation 0. This is because past Ascension 4 / level 70, you start getting into the RNG part of the game, where in order to upgrade your talents past level 6, you definitely need that weekly boss drop. Most people are going to get lucky and get it, but there's going to be people who are going to go weeks on end without ever getting that material. Ever. And it's going to suck. So, I'm going to keep it at talent level 6. Also, Constellations, obviously. If you're not spending it all on one character, chances are you're not going to get those Constellations. Much less Constellations 2 or 4 for both Beidou and Razor. That's not happening unless you're whaling, and if you're whaling, your team is probably filled with 5 stars anyways, so you don't need this video. Finally, as a note, damage won't be calculated in flat damage, but rather their damage percentiles. This goes back to the whole concept that artifacts and weapons are variable, it depends on what you get, and also, your artifacts are super RNG heavy, so I can't even determine how much attack you're really going to have at any given point of time, because if you get lucky with that God Roll Cup, well, you're going to do a lot more damage than another unit that does not have the God Roll Cup. Anyways, before we get into the actual math, I had to take a lot of numbers from the wiki, so props to them. I'm going to be looking at the calculations for Razor's DPS first, because he's actually easier to deal with his simpler kit. First up, we have his normal attack, Steel Fang. Now, look at the following damages. Since we're looking at Ascension 4, I'm using the stats at talent level 6. Duh. Note I am excluding the charge attack damage because you're not using the charge attack with Razor. I don't think he even gets to use it when his burst is up, so ignore that. Simply put, to find out the damage percent per second, which I'll be shortening to just percent per second, I added all the damage percentiles together first for a nice total of 575% damage. Now remember, every character has a special stat that increases when they hit certain ascensions. For Razor, he gets a boost to his physical damage percent. So at Ascension 4, this equals a 15% buff, increasing his total normal attack damage percent to 661.25%. Using footage from the game, I measured the time it took from the beginning of the first strike to the exact moment of the sword right before you can animation cancel. Essentially, this is the total time it takes for a normal attack rotation. From my measurements, it takes approximately 2.6 seconds for Razor to finish one normal attack rotation, so we take his total damage, 661.25, divided by that 2.6 to get us 254.33% per second. Next damage calculation we need to make is the elemental skill damage percent per second, so Razor's skill, Claw and Thunder, has the following damage percents. Again, we're looking at A4 Razor, level 6 damage percents, yada yada yada. Now, Razor's skill has two ways of being used. The first is by tapping E, the other is by holding E. The exact specifics of these skills I'll leave to other content creators and the wiki, as I'm only looking at the raw damage, and also this is where the energy particle regeneration stuff gets into play, and I'm not going to look into that. So calculating the damage percent per second for this skill is actually pretty easy, since we have the cooldowns already on the wiki. So on a press, the cooldown is 6 seconds, while a hold has a 10-second cooldown. Now, Razor's typical rotation, as far as I understand it, is to do a tap-tap-hold kind of combo, so this gives us a total cooldown of 22 seconds. At Ascension 4, Razor gains the passive talent Awakening, which decreases his skill's cooldown by 18%. So that means we have to change his original cooldowns of 6, 10, and 22 by 0.82, which then gives us the following new cooldowns of 4.92, 8.2, and 18.04 seconds. 18.04 being the important one here since it's the aggregate cooldown. Adding on top of that though, this passive talent also resets the cooldown of the skill whenever the burst is used, and since a tap-tap-hold combo takes approximately 18.04 seconds, this allows a perfect rotation of the skill to include an extra tap before using the burst, resetting the rotation. This all happens within the burst cooldown, which is 20 seconds long. With all these total damage percents, we can now get into the percent per second of the skill. A total damage for an absolute perfect combo is 1,250%. We then divide this by the total time of 20 seconds, which gives us 62.5% per second, which is actually pretty low compared to his normal attacks, but this is pretty common compared to all units. Finally, we get to the last core percent per second calculation needed for Razor. His burst, Lightning Fang, has these values at level 6. Now, there are a couple interesting things with Razor's burst, so let me explain them a tiny bit. The first point of interest is the Soul Companion damage percent. When Razor uses his burst, he summons a wolf thing that deals additional damage with each normal attack. This is important later on. The second point of interest is the normal attack speed bonus percent. As an attack speed bonus percent, this acts as a damage multiplier for all attacks that are directly linked to his normal attacks. So, besides these 2 points, the actual elemental burst damage percent is pretty low, especially once I calculate the percent per second. Now, in order to find the aggregate percent per second of the burst, we first take the elemental burst damage percent and divide it by 20 seconds to get us 11.2% per second, which is very incredibly low, but that's not the point of his burst. The point of his burst is Soul Companion damage percent. First, to do this, we have to take the listed damage by 4, because he's hitting 4 times in one rotation. Then we multiply it by the attack speed bonus, 1.36, before finally dividing it by the total time it takes for a normal attack rotation, 2.6 seconds. This gives us 70.3% per second for the Soul Companion damage, and a total of 81.5% per second for the entire burst. With all of the stats calculated, we just add them all together for the damage he does during his burst. So we have his normal attack of 254.33% per second, multiplied by the burst attack speed bonus of 1.36, for a nice total of 345.89% per second. Next, we add his skill damage of 62.5% per second and his burst damage of 81.5% per second to give us a grand total of 489.89% per second. However, Razor's burst is only up for 15 seconds out of 20, so we have to account for the percent per second when the burst is on cooldown. This is pretty simple because when the burst is on cooldown, we just don't factor in the bonus attack speed and the bonus electro damage from the wolf. This gives us a normal attack of 254.33, a skill attack of 62.5, and a burst attack of 11.2. If you're wondering why I included that burst damage again, it's because that damage percent per second is happening over the course of the entire 20 seconds and not just the 15 seconds when the burst is active. This gives us a total of 328.03% per second, which is much lower compared to his on-burst damage. Now all we have to do is multiply his active burst damage percent per second by 15/20, since this is the time active versus the time inactive. Then we have to add it to his inactive burst percent per second, multiplied by 5/20, to give us a final percent per second of 449.42%. Okay, now for a small breather from the math. In case you didn't get it, Razor does 450% per second, roughly. In case anyone wants, here's a shot of the Excel sheet. You can look through it. It's pretty straightforward. If you look through it and you're like, wait, hold on, Zoob, you did something wrong, throw it in the comments below. I don't know if I've done everything right. I think I did, but mistakes happen, my dudes. Now, before we move on to Beidou's DPS, I want to address some assumptions I had to make that are kind of specific to Razor. First, he is primarily a physical damage dealer, so I don't really know if players actually do the E combo I did. Like, do people do it? I don't know. I don't own him, so I can't say for a fact that's how he should be played. But I'm assuming that you're spamming the button. Second, I didn't account for animation time, but Razor's attack speed is so high, animation time is pretty much a non-issue. With those out of the way, we can now start on Beidou's stats, so hold on to your seats. Luckily, Beidou follows a lot of the same conventions and arithmetic that Razor did, so I'm not going to lead you through the entire mathematical process again. Realistically, the math only differs for skills and bursts, but we're going to take a look at her normal attack Oceanborn anyways. Again, we're looking at level 6, and adding these total percents together gets us 623%. Her total normal attack time rotation is about 3.4 seconds, so this gives us 183.24% per second. Next, we have her skill, Tidecaller. Now the thing with Beidou's skill is that it deals extra damage per attack block up to a total of 2 attacks blocked. This just means that at level 6, a full counter deals 170 plus 224 times 2, for a total of 618 damage percent. Divide this by the total cooldown of 7.5 seconds, and we get a percent per second of 82.4, which is very low. But remember, every character has a secondary stat increase, and Beidou's is electro damage percent, and at level 6, it's an extra 12% damage. So Beidou's skill actually does a total of 692.16% in one attack, but her percent per second is still 92.29. So still incredibly low. Now, Beidou's burst, Stormbreaker, is where she gets her actual DPS from, so let's take a look at that. Unfortunately, the wiki doesn't actually have the values for Beidou's burst at level 6. Fortunately, I do. As we can see here, the burst has a base damage of 170% and a lightning damage of 134%. The fun thing with Beidou's burst is that for the duration it's active, every normal attack will generate a lightning arc capped at 1 arc per second. This means that a perfect execution of this burst will allow Beidou to discharge 14 lightning arcs. This is because we're assuming that she uses her skill at some point during the duration of the burst, and the fact that the instant the burst is used starts the countdown. So all we have to do is take the base damage percent divided by the total cooldown of 20 seconds and multiply by the electro damage bonus percent to get us 9.52% per second. Then, we take the lightning arc damage, multiply by 14 over 15, since we're dealing this damage 14 times total over 15 seconds, and then multiplying it by the electro damage bonus percent to get us 140.07% per second. Add the two values together, and we have a total damage percent per second for the burst at 149.59, which is a much higher contribution than the skill. Like with Razor, we just have to add up all these numbers. So we have 183.24 from the normal attack, 92.29 from the skill, and 149.59 from the burst. Together, we get 425.12% per second, which is much less than Razor's damage. Or is it? Turns out, Beidou still has one trick left, her passive talents, Lightning Storm and Retribution. First, Retribution allows Beidou to do maximum damage with her skill if she counters just before she gets hit. And as long as Beidou does maximum damage with Tidecaller, her normal and charged attacks gain a 15% damage buff, as well as a 15% attack speed buff, all courtesy of Lightning Storm. This essentially translates to a 32.25% normal attack buff. Now, anyone who uses Beidou will also know that she uses her charge attack, but this is highly dependent on your stamina and how long you've been in the battle, so I'm not going to be using it. Now, with the passive buffs, we have 183.24 from the normal attack times the buffs to get 242.33% per second. We add that to the 92.29 from the skill and 149.59 from the burst for a new grand total of 484.21% per second. This actually puts Beidou pretty much on par with Razor. But of course, we're still not done yet. We still have to do the averages. Just like Razor, Beidou's burst is only active for 15 seconds and it's down for 5. To simplify it, I'm just going to tell you the damage done while the burst isn't active. It's 344.14% per second, alright? You don't need the math, you know how the math is done. Now we just multiply this value by 5 over 20, add the active burst damage, and multiply that value by 15 over 20 to get an average damage percent per second of 449.19% per second. Now, I know this is going to happen. The Razor stands are going to come out with the argument that this is assuming that Beidou can use her counter every time it comes up, when it's really dependent on enemies attacking. Well, yes, and this is the main reason people believe that Beidou is at best B tier. But I have to say, as a Beidou main, in Domains and Spiral Abyss, you are going to be fighting enough enemies, generally, to do that 7.5 second counters. When there aren't enough enemies, like when you're killing a lot of them, yes, Beidou is going to have a very hard time killing everything and proccing her counter any faster than 8 to 10 seconds. Now those values are above. This situation typically arises when you're fighting the elite bosses like the Stasis, Regisvine, etc., etc. Or, again, like I said, on the final dregs of a domain. Even when you're fighting some of the mini-bosses like Ruin Guards or Lava Trolls, you are still getting attacked about once every 7.5 to 9 seconds. But as the math shows, the majority of Beidou's damage is actually from her normal attacks and her burst, and not as many people believe from her skill, though her skill does have a very niche use. And in regards to her burst, I do want to say this now, as I did say I was going to talk about it. Many people will say that she hits too slow to be able to hit 14 hits of lightning. Given the assumptions earlier, this is technically a non-issue, but I'm not looking at just the ideal form of these units, I'm also looking at real game application. So I tested this in-game. Since Beidou's burst lightning actually can bounce from unit to unit, as long as you're fighting more than one enemy in close proximity, you are going to be able to hit, at bare minimum, 14 strikes of lightning. During my testing, I was able to proc 9 lightning strikes against the lone lava troll, so it's not too far to assume that in something like Spiral Abyss, you'd be able to hit at least 14. In an absolute perfect scenario, you might be able to hit upwards of 20 lightning strikes, but considering dodges, flinches, animation times, and all that, this is practically not possible, but 14 is definitely possible. So let's put these two units' DPS together. For all of you who skipped to this point, here are the numbers. As we can see here, Razor is indeed the better DPS unit, with a whopping 0.23% per second extra damage. Now remember, typical attack at this level is about 1500 to 1700. So Razor is doing about 3.45 to 3.91 extra damage per second. Even if we use the 8 seconds cooldown for Beidou, we can see that at the typical attack value, Razor will now do 90 to 102 extra damage per second. It's not that much. But hold on, before everyone starts flying out of their seats, right now, we've only looked at the ideal damage. These are two units in their most perfect setting, with maximum burst being applied and no possible external factors. So, with these in mind, I'm going to be dropping several of the assumptions made earlier and take these optimized DPS units, put them into hypothetical 4-man teams, and put them against typical enemy AI. The first factor I'd like to bring up are the elemental reactions. If you don't understand how they work, how are you still playing the game? But here's the basics of it. When two elements affect a single unit, extra effects occur. It's pretty basic stuff. Given that both units here are Electro, there are 3 elemental reactions they can proc that actually mean anything. First, Overload, next, Electrocharge, and lastly, Superconduct. Now, the Chinese community has figured out a lot of stuff regarding elemental reactions, but it's very complicated, and the shortened form is you can't always constantly proc elemental reactions. So, right now, Superconduct is the most important. If you don't know what Superconduct does, it essentially does a small amount of cryo AoE damage, then it reduces the physical resistance by 40% for about 8 to 9 seconds. This means in a typical 4-party team, if one of your units is a cryo unit, you're likely to have Superconduct's debuff constantly applied. This in turn buffs your normal and charged attacks by approximately 15 to 30%, at least according to preliminary evidence. I'm not entirely sure what the exact numbers are. Anyways, Razor's average physical damage percent per second is 323. So, applying this Superconduct buff, his total damage, at least physical, will increase to a minimum of 371.45 and a maximum of 419.9. Meanwhile, Beidou's average physical damage percent per second is only 242.33, so this will only increase to a minimum of 278.68 or a maximum of 315.03. Ultimately, if we add in the skills and burst to these two units, Razor's total average damage percent per second is a minimum 497.88 and at maximum 546.33. Beidou's total damage is going to increase to a minimum of 485.55 and a maximum, of 521.9. We're now looking at a total difference of 12.33% to a maximum of 24.33%. And what about criticals? Well, criticals is a very strange thing because not every character gets the stat increase. There are certain units like Kutzing that get a massive boost to their crit damage, but for the most part, This is going to depend on your artifacts and how lucky you are with RNGs. Assuming you've built absolutely no additional critical from artifacts, every character has a base 5% crit rate and a base 50% crit damage. And with crit being calculated by this simplified formula, we see our initial values grow just the tiniest bit further apart. We're now looking at a minimum difference of 12.64% and a maximum difference of 25.04%. Compared to the values from before, they're pretty much identical. Again, the extra damage from criticals are highly dependent on your artifacts, and mathematically, the more crit stats you stack on, the bigger this gap becomes. If I had those max stats for crit rate and crit damage, I'd calculate this, but as of now, the wiki doesn't have the substat scalings for crit rate and crit damage. I don't even have an estimate on how substat scalings work. So unfortunately, I can't even begin to calculate the actual max damage you can deal. However, there is a theory that you can hit about 200% crit damage and 100% crit rate. There are people who have approached these values. I don't know if this is a hard cap or if it's a soft cap, but people got close to these numbers. So I decided to do the math at these values to show that the total difference in damage percent actually increases. So doing the math, I figured that the minimum damage percent will increase to 37% and the maximum damage percent increases to 73%. So it's possible for your crit to be a decent upgrade and actually pushes the two units further apart. Again, maximum, your Razor is dealing 73% per second more than Beidou. However, when you are running at 100% crit rate and 200% crit damage, these two units' total damage percent per second is now at about 1600%. Which means that this 73% difference accounts for less than 5% of all damage dealt. For those who know anything about stats, there is no statistical difference between these two characters at this point. They are functionally, statistically identical. For those who don't know what those mean, in simpler terms, that 73% per second is incredibly unlikely to be the difference between killing an enemy and having it survive. Because when you're running at 1,600% damage percent per second, things are dying. And let's be honest, how many of us are really going to get even a half-decent artifacts? Also, you'll notice that I used the damage scalings of Superconduct active. And I just want to point out that there's currently only 3 cryo characters: Kaya, Chongyun, and Chi-Chi. I'm not counting Diona because I don't actually know how she works yet. Now, of these 3, only Chi-Chi can cause a repeated reliable Superconduct proc without having to switch back to her. This is because when she uses her E, she constantly procs cryo on all enemies around her. Kaya can't do that unless you're using his burst, which requires his burst to be fully charged at the time, and also, it only lasts about 8 seconds. If you're using Chongyun to do Superconduct for a melee user like Razor, you're using them wrong. So currently, the only solid cryo user in terms of proccing Superconduct is a 5-star character that doesn't have a rate up banner. Good luck on that. Now those two were more solid, mathematically accountable factors. With the elemental reactions, there were the damage buff values, and for crit and crit damage, there are stats that I can use to calculate damage. But not every factor is like that. Things like enemy-related factors and behaviors can't be quantified. For instance, flinching, or staggering depending on who you talk to. Whenever you hit a light enemy, they immediately flinch, where they take a few steps backwards. Heavier enemies typically only flinch when they're hit by a particularly strong attack, like the last hit of a claymore, or burst/skills. The issue here is that Beidou's counter relies on being hit. But if she's normal attacking, the light enemies are simply too busy flinching to actually attack. As I did say earlier, against enough enemies this isn't a problem because you can't hit all of them at the same time. But once you get down to about 1 or 2 melee enemies, this is a much larger issue. Against heavy enemies like Ruin Guards or Middle Churls, this is practically a non-issue. But because of that last hit of the Claymore, Beidou is actually suffering a bit more than Razor would. Next we have Elemental Shields. So enemies like the Fatui and Abyss Mages can invoke an Elemental Shield that requires certain reactions to break them. Given Razor's much higher attack speed, he will burst down their shields faster, which will allow him to kill them way faster. And that's not even mentioning enemies that are straight up immune to electro damage, like slimes or the hypostasis, where a great majority of Beidou's damage is straight up ineffective. So these three factors all make Razor a much more powerful DPS unit in comparison to Beidou. But that isn't quite all yet. One perk, albeit a very small one, for Beidou, is that light enemies have very low base health. If you pair this factor with her very, very high instant damage, you essentially have a one-shot attack every 7.5 seconds. To put it in perspective, at level 70, an Ascension 4 Beidou with no additional crit rate or crit damage can pull off an average of 703.72% damage to everything around her at once. On the other hand, Razor's maximum instant damage is 423.33. So, in certain situations where your attack stat is just incredibly high, Beidou is actually going to be faster at killing these mobs than Razor, because at the start of her fight, she just has to press E once and everything dies. But this is limited to the mob characters / light enemies. Don't plan on being able to delete everything if that everything includes mid-Churls or ruin guards. Now that's all for the enemy-related factors, but there are also other factors that aren't affected by the hard stats, and these are the party dynamic and unit-specific factors. So the first thing I want to talk about here is swapping units. When you use Razor, you kind of have to use everything before he bursts. If you forgot to use your Xiangling's burst, or if you need to heal, but you've already pressed Q with Razor out, you can't switch back, or Razor's burst will straight up vanish. It does give back some energy to him, but you lose all that DPS you could have been doing. Now, this might not sound like a big deal, but there are a couple instances where you will need to swap your team multiple times in order to either survive or perform specific elemental reactions in order to break down shields. Not only that, not everyone's burst charges at the same rate, so Razor will have to wait, not just for his own burst to be up, but his entire setup's burst, at least all the damage dealing setup. The next factor we have is dodging. Every once in a while, an enemy will do an attack that you will want to dodge in order to avoid flinching. Typically, these kinds of attacks come from heavy enemies, like the Ruin Guard's missiles, or any of the Ruin Guard attacks in general, mid-troll attacks, etc., etc. But there are also some light enemies that can do this, like the Flame Club Hilichurls, the Grenadiers, or the Crossbows. In these cases, Beidou is actually better because that every once in a while, the required dodge can be replaced with her counter, which allows her to not only deal damage when no other character would be able to, but more importantly, she remains in an optimal position to continue attacking where most other units would require an additional dash to get back in position. Also, because of this, Beidou can conserve more stamina, which allows her to dodge more. Finally, we have Elemental Self-Procs. In short, several abilities apply elements directly to the unit when you use it, like Barbara's Heal, which applies the Hydro element to your whatever active unit you have on. So Razor's burst actually gives them an electrostatus until the burst ends. Beidou's skill also gives her an electrostatus, but hers only lasts for about half a second. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Why does this, if you have an element on you, who cares? The enemies care mostly because when you have that element on you, the enemies can proc elemental reactions centered on you. Now granted, Razor's burst gives some invulnerability to the electrocharge status. It straight up says it in his toolkit. But he still remains susceptible to Superconduct, and more importantly, Overload, whose explosion can cause Razor to be knocked around. Beidou is the opposite. Since she gains a shield and interruption resistance while using her shield, Overload ends up not really affecting her at all. She's only actually affected by Electrocharge and Superconduct, especially Electrocharge, because once she gets that Electrocharge status, she'll continuously flinch for about a second, which allows enemies to chain attacks into her. Get it? Now, Superconduct's main gimmick is the physical resistance debuff, and that technically affects them both equally, But given Razor's ability to make all enemies flinch really quickly, and Beidou's shield, you're not actually taking that much damage, so Superconduct is kind of non-essential. And that's pretty much it, I think. I probably missed at least one variable somewhere, but I'm relatively confident in the core math. Of course, I must point out that these values are purely hypothetical ideal values. You shouldn't expect your Razor or Beidou to get anywhere close to these numbers unless you have a 100% uptime shield that negates the need to dodge entirely. So in conclusion, Razor is in fact the better DPS. By how much? Well, if we use the 8 seconds per counter Beidou, we have a difference of 6% per second, while if we use a 10 seconds per counter, we have a difference of 20% per second. But we are in fact looking at over 400% per second, so these differences aren't actually all that significant until your attack value begins to hit the several thousands range. If we do apply all the external factors like superconduct or elemental immunities or elemental shields, this gap does become apparent to any casual player, so Razor can still be considered definitively better than Beidou. At the same time, I must also admit that it's going to take a lot of effort to get Beidou to get even close to Razor's DPS. Her counter is difficult to get a hold of, it's also pretty situational, and in fights against helpless enemies or flinching enemies, she will suffer a massive DPS drop. Now personally, if I had both characters, and I could only choose one to level up, I'd choose Beidou. Unless you have 0 other DPS units, Beidou is better because she can function as a flex unit. She works as both a DPS unit and a support DPS unit. That 134% per second damage from her burst is incredibly useful, especially on any other character that hits fast and consistent. In fact, on a polearm or short sword user, it's possible to hit all 15 strikes of lightning within that 15-second period. Razor, on the other hand, will only ever deal damage when he's on the field. But if you're only looking for damage, he's definitely easier and definitively stronger. However, I would suggest that instead of looking at the numbers, the meta picks, or any particular game stat, you look at how fun each character is to you. If you do in fact own both characters, play them both, find out whose playstyle fits with your vision, and just go with it. Genshin Impact is a single-player game, and honestly, the bulk of any character's damage is less on them and their skills, and way more on the state of your artifacts and weapons. Even Barbara can be built to hit like a tank with the right artifacts. So, just choose whoever you find more fun, and don't worry too much about the meta. And, that pretty much wraps up the video. Thanks for watching.